for today's movie review, I'll be reviewing Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, the overall 18th installment of the Godzilla franchise and the third installment of the Heisei continuity. And as far as production of this movie is concerned, with Godzilla vs. Biollante being a box office disappointment, the producers of the Godzilla franchise had to rethink their strategy moving forward when it came to making newer Godzilla movies. Starting with what could have been the second rematch with King Kong, because if you saw my review for King Kong vs. Godzilla, during the introduction of that particular review, I mentioned that Toho tried to remake King Kong vs. Godzilla on several different occasions, way before Warner Brothers did the MonsterVerse movies. And basically during the 90s, sometime after Godzilla vs. Biollante flopped at the box office, this is one of those points in time where Toho tried to remake King Kong vs. Godzilla set within the Heisei continuity. However, this never came to be because Turner Entertainment asked too much money for the character King Kong to be used. So Toho decided to abandon this particular remake of King Kong vs. Godzilla in favor of Godzilla vs. Mechanicong, which would have pitted Godzilla against the mechanical doppelganger of King Kong from the 1967 giant monster movie King Kong Escapes. And the only thing that was known about this movie was that one of the major plot points was that during a battle with Godzilla, the pilots of Mechanicon would have shot some kind of missile or device that would have injected a small platoon of human soldiers to fight Godzilla's body cell structure, resulting in a battle with Godzilla both external and internal, supposedly. However, Turner Entertainment thought that Mechanicon was way too similar to King Kong and asked for money much like before with King Kong. So eventually Toho decided to throw a poll out there asking people what classic monster from the show period would the audience like to see again. And two of the more popular choices were King Ghidorah along with Mothra. So Toho naturally decided to bring Godzilla's most famous foe, King Ghidorah, to use for this particular movie, resulting in Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, a movie that's gotten a very interesting reception over the years, especially within the Godzilla community. Because if you're someone who paid attention to the Godzilla community back during the Cinemassacre's Monster Madness Godzilla-thon around 2007-2008, a lot of Godzilla fans considered this to be one of the best installments of the franchise. But when you look at the Godzilla community now in a post-Shin Godzilla world, this movie falls into the category of you either love it or you hate it kind of deal. Or the Heisei era of Godzilla in general. But I think from what I could gather, most people still enjoyed the movie nonetheless. But anywho, this movie holds a ton of significance to me as a Godzilla fan because Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah is the first full-length feature Godzilla movie I ever saw as a kid. Yes, technically the first American-produced Godzilla movie from 1998 is the first Godzilla movie I ever saw, but if we're talking strictly Japanese, it would go to Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah because growing up, as I mentioned in the past, I have seen bits and pieces of some of the other installments of the franchise, but mainly from the middle to the end. With Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, on the other hand, it's the first Godzilla movie I ever saw from start to finish, thanks to a Godzilla marathon that was being played on Sci-Fi at the time. But anywho, was Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah worthy of reintroducing Godzilla's longtime arch nemesis King Ghidorah to a whole new generation of people back in 1991? As for the plot of this movie, set sometime after the events of Godzilla vs. Biollante, in the year 1992, a UFO suddenly appears over Japan, revealing itself to the Japanese government that they are a group of time travelers from the 23rd century who have come back to the year 1992 to warn the Japanese government that sometime in the 21st century, Godzilla will cause a catastrophic event that could potentially wipe out all of mankind, and suggest a way to rid the world of Godzilla once and for all by taking key individuals ranging from politicians to civilians that in some shape or form have a connection to Godzilla himself and travel back to a period where Godzilla was just a regular dinosaur that had not been mutated by the H-Bomb testing that was done in the Bikini Atoll that led to his eventual creation. Upon completion of this task, in return to the year 1992, all of the characters discovered that a new giant monster has appeared in the form of a three-headed golden dragon called King Ghidorah, a living biological weapon created by the time travelers themselves in order to destroy Japan so it will not become the dominant economic force in the 23rd century. However, unknown to everyone, Godzilla was still created and is now on a collision course to fight King Ghidorah. Can the humans of the 20th century prevent the time travelers' plans into becoming reality, or will the time travelers' prophecy of Godzilla destroying the 21st century come to pass? Now, in terms of what I liked about the movie, before going any further, keep in mind, my frame of reference for watching this movie is in its English dub, and I'll probably repeat this point over and over again, but anywho, technically speaking, yes, the English dub for this movie is bad, but for me personally, it's so bad, it's good, because this movie has some pretty nonsensical lines of dialogue that are hilarious to listen to. Two that come to mind that crack me up every time I even hear them are, "It's a giant dinosaur and it's attacking our boys," to "Take that, you dinosaur." Now sure, a movie with a bad English dub might be a big problem to most people, but for me, hearing a bad English dub in a movie like this just makes the movie just that much more enjoyable to watch. Much like the English dubbed moments in the Japanese cut of Godzilla vs. Biollante. Another aspect of the movie I liked is that we get to explore Godzilla's origin within this movie, because between Godzilla Raids Again up to Terror Mechagodzilla, we never really fully explored the origin of how Godzilla became Godzilla. Sure, in the original 1954 movie, there is a scene where a couple of the scientists speculate that Godzilla was some type of prehistoric creature that was awakened by nuclear bomb testing, but nothing definitive. With this movie, on the other hand, it gives us a definitive origin of how Godzilla became Godzilla. As it turns out, he was a giant theropod dinosaur called a Godzillasaurus, not to be confused with the actual Godzillasaurus, that was living peacefully on a tropical island during World War II, which resulted in him in battling the US forces along with the US Navy, and eventually this led to the atomic bomb testings in the Bikini Atoll. Now sure, moving past both this particular movie along with this era of the Godzilla franchise in general, Godzilla seems to get a new origin in every other movie continuity. But a lot of people do generally agree that the origin that this movie presents is the definitive origin that I think most people agree with and take influence from. Much like how Batman the Animated Series gives a new origin for the Batman villain Mr. Freeze, and moving past that show, that's the origin that everybody thinks of and uses for Mr. Freeze. And on top of that, see the Godzillasaurus battling the US forces along with the US Navy is a pretty neat thing to see on screen, since that's never really been done before. And on top of that, I just love the idea of a scenario where you have a World War II setting in which a group of soldiers encounter a prehistoric creature of sorts. I feel that could be a movie in its own right, but for the context of this movie, I think that scene of Godzillasaurus does a good job of giving us an origin of who and what Godzilla was before his eventual mutation. And speaking of Godzilla, this movie does something interesting with Godzilla's role presented within the context of the movie. But not for the reason you think, because when you look at the Godzilla franchise before the Heisei era, Godzilla, depending on the movie, either is the bad guy from start to finish, like he is in the original Godzilla vs. Mothra, or he's presented as a good guy as seen in Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla from 1974. And a lot of fans point to this movie being the one where they really change up his role within the movie, in which he starts out being the bad guy, then turns into a good guy, then goes back to being a bad guy again. For me personally, I don't believe that is the case. I believe Godzilla, much like the previous two installments, is still a bad guy through and through. And when confronting King Ghidorah, it's not a battle between a good and evil monster. It's a battle between two evil monsters. It's just the Japanese would rather deal with Godzilla since he's presented as the lesser of two evils in this case. But I'm not talking about Godzilla being the hero or villain of this movie. I'm talking more about his role within the thematical context. Because remember, back in the original 1954 movie, Godzilla was meant to represent the usage of nuclear weapons. And to some degree, without going into propaganda territory, is also meant to represent America itself. Yet, with this movie and the time travel, Godzilla's role, thematically speaking, changes completely. Because Godzilla in this movie no longer represents America. Godzilla is meant to represent Japan itself. Whereas King Ghidorah, on the other hand, takes Godzilla's place of representing America. And while on that subject, I am fully aware of the controversy this movie has in regards to it being anti-American. Because a lot of people state that this movie is straight up anti-American. Even when the movie came out back in the day, Ishiro Honda, the guy who directed the original 1954 Gojira movie, stated that the director in this movie went too far. Whether or not that is the case, here's the way I look at it. You have to remember, Japan back in the day, during World War II, did some pretty nasty things other than the whole Pearl Harbor attack. Everything from the Nanking Massacre to the experiments of Unit 731, the presence of so-called comfort women, and other various war crimes. So I think having Godzilla representing Japan in that context makes a lot of sense. Whether or not that's intentional, I have no idea. But if that is the case, this leads us right into perhaps what is one of the most iconic scenes, not just within the context of this movie, but within the franchise as a whole, the reunion between Shindo and Godzilla near the end of the movie before Godzilla's final confrontation with Mecha King Ghidorah. Because that scene, for years, has garnered many debates between critics and fans alike. Because it's just one of those scenes where people could just look at it and interpret it in many different ways. But if I had to put in my own 2 cents on the whole matter, let's really look at this scene, starting with Shindo himself. Because back in World War II, he was an honorable soldier who was serving the Japanese Empire during World War II. Now remember, the Japanese during World War II kind of had their own agenda in which they tried to fulfill their own manifest destiny by expanding the Japanese Empire across several other landmasses. That way they were all under the influence of the Japanese Empire, which never happened. Now, moving forward to Shindo in the year 1992, he's now kind of a crooked businessman. I mean, the guy owns an illegal nuclear submarine. So when we do see his eventual reunion with Godzilla, I think Shindo in the year 1992 is meant to represent Japan around that time period, because outside of the movie, the Japanese tried to teach their own history to a younger generation, in which they never did any of the horrific war crimes that I mentioned earlier. So I think having Godzilla representing Japan in that context, and having him show up literally in front of Shindo, is meant to symbolize how Japan should not have forgotten the horrific stuff they did during World War II. In that the past is coming back to haunt everybody. Hence why I think Shindo in that scene nodded to Godzilla to give him permission to kill him, so that people can remember the horrific things the Japanese did in World War II. At least that's one way of looking at it. Now, with all this in mind, the movie is giving both Godzilla and King Ghidorah a tragic relationship to one another, because both Godzilla and King Ghidorah parallel one another within the context of this movie. Since you have Godzilla, who was revived by the Japanese to fight King Ghidorah, while you have King Ghidorah, who was made by the Americans to destroy Japan. It just happens to get on a collision course with Godzilla. And that's another thing I liked about this movie, is Godzilla's relationship between King Ghidorah and Biollante. Because unlike a movie such as the 2014 The Amazing Spider-Man movie, where the filmmakers try to give Spider-Man some kind of relationship with all the villains through one source, that being Oscorp, this here, yes, Godzilla does have a relationship with both King Ghidorah and Biollante, but it doesn't come from the same place. They come from 2 completely different places altogether. And not only that, but this movie also carries the same kind of theme that Godzilla vs. Biollante had, which is it ethically right to abuse science and technology to create a weapon of a biological or technological nature? And remember, Godzilla within this continuity was moving away from being an allegory of the usage of nuclear weapons to becoming becoming more of a destructive force in nature itself that only was awakened to put mankind in its place. Whereas King Ghidorah, on the other hand, much like Biollante, is meant to represent the misusage of science and technology for the sole purpose of creating weapons of mass destruction. So, one way to look at the conflict between Godzilla and King Ghidorah is to view it as nature versus science and technology, and that no matter how advanced the science and technology is, it's bound to fail against nature in some capacity. And while on the subject of Godzilla and King Ghidorah, I do find it super refreshing that here's a movie in which Godzilla battles King Ghidorah, and it's just Godzilla and no other monster helping him out. Because in the Showa period of the Godzilla franchise, anytime King Ghidorah showed up to battle Godzilla, Godzilla always had help. No matter if it was him teaming up with Rodan and Mothra to fight him in King Ghidorah's first appearance, Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster, or the final battle in Destroy All Monsters where all the Earth monsters battle King Ghidorah, to even Godzilla vs. Gigan, where Godzilla and Anguirus had to battle Gigan and King Ghidorah. So it is kind of surprising for that time period we never really had a one-on-one match between Godzilla and King Ghidorah. But at the same time, that Ghidorah was different because King Ghidorah in that continuity was an intergalactic planet-destroying dragon, whereas King Ghidorah in this continuity was a living biological weapon created by the Futurians from the 23rd century. So I do find it refreshing that for at least one movie we had Godzilla battle King Ghidorah by himself without the assistance of any other monster to help him out. And as for the actual battle between Godzilla and King Ghidorah in this movie, I think the fight is handled very well since there is a good balance between melee combat and long-range combat, and there are several memorable moments that occur throughout the fight. My favorite one being the point where Godzilla fires his atomic breath at King Ghidorah's metal head and it just blows off. To me, that's just a really awesome moment. Not just within the context of this movie or this Heisei period of the Godzilla franchise, but within the entire Godzilla franchise as a whole in general. Now, in terms of how Godzilla and King Ghidorah are depicted in this movie, Godzilla, in regards to both character and suitmation, honestly is really no different than the way he was depicted in the previous two installments, minus the emotional reunion between him and Shindo, as I mentioned earlier, in which we see Godzilla appearing to be sad within that moment as he remembers Shindo from World War II when Godzilla was still the Godzillasaurus, resulting in Godzilla what appears to be him crying as he remembers Shindo from that particular time period. But again, nothing too different here. As far as King Ghidorah is concerned, personality-wise, nothing too interesting because it is very reminiscent to King Ghidorah in some of the later installments of the Showa era where King Ghidorah was essentially a mindless puppet under the control of someone else. But I think King Ghidorah serves that function very well within this movie, given that he is just a biological weapon for the Futurians. Now, as far as design is concerned, I honestly like the design to King Ghidorah in this movie more than the Showa era, for the simple reason that he looks a lot more ferocious. And I know a lot of people wanted to see this version of King Ghidorah with the manes that the original Showa incarnation had. I think this version not having the manes was probably a smart move on the filmmaker's part. And the way King Ghidorah is depicted in this movie, as far as suitmation is concerned, while not as technologically impressive as Biollante's final form in Godzilla vs. Biollante, I still think that King Ghidorah is an impressive special effect to behold, considering that not only are there multiple people operating each head, the wings, and the tails, but there's also someone moving inside of it. And unlike Biollante's final form in the previous movie, the filmmakers were able to accomplish a lot more with King Ghidorah during his initial fight with Godzilla in this movie. Another aspect of the movie I really liked has to do with the villains of the movie in the form of the Futurians. Because as far as the actual human cast of characters is concerned, I'm gonna be honest, I think they're fine, but it's not the most memorable cast of characters in a Godzilla movie. But the villains, however, exceed in being memorable. Because the best way to describe the villains of this movie, they're very much like Kornuma, the leader of the Black Hole aliens from the 1974 Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla movie. In that sense where both bad guys are very cartoony, and the actors playing them are giving these really over-the-top performances, in which anytime you see them acting. They're just chewing the scenery left and right, but it's done in a very delightful way. And while their acting is exactly that, the characters themselves are, if I had to describe them, their demeanor is like that of a James Bond villain, where they're very intellectually dangerous. If they happen to have a heavy dose of Saturday morning cartoony villainy added to the mix. And let's not forget, perhaps the most memorable human character in the movie. And when I mean human, I mean android, M11. For the simple reason that this was clearly a character that was inspired by the Terminator, and some of the scenes he appears in are just really hilarious, especially that car chase that occurs halfway through the movie. And the performance the actor that plays M11, when you first meet him, kind of just gives this one-note performance, which makes a lot of sense given that the character is an android. But once he switches sides and becomes a good guy, he gains a little bit of a personality, which makes the character very entertaining to watch, regardless if he's acting very heroic in one moment, but also acting kinda comical in another. But I'm really getting off topic here. Long story short, the Futurians in this movie are easily the best part of the human plotline of the movie, because of how over the top they are. Now on to the review in which I discuss aspects of the movie I had mixed feelings on. The big one goes to the time travel element of the movie itself, because between 1954 Godzilla up to Godzilla vs. Biollante from a few years earlier, all the Godzilla movies we've had within that time frame have either been giant monster run amok stories, alien invasion plots, surviving on an island, but we've never had a Godzilla movie revolve around time travel. Even when we had more outlandish plot lines in the 1970s Showa era of the Godzilla franchise, none of them had any time traveling plots whatsoever. So having a Godzilla movie with a time traveling plotline is definitely something that's new to the franchise. Sure, the idea of time traveling is nothing new within the realm of science fiction, but it's definitely a very new concept introduced within the Godzilla franchise that we have not seen before or after this movie. Now, the problem with this movie's time travel plot is the execution behind it, because time travel in general is a very tricky type of storyline to handle. Even movies such as Back to the Future, which the filmmakers of this movie took inspiration from, which is why Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah had a time travel story to begin with, has some problems with it. But with this movie, it's just a whole nother level of extreme that honestly could take up half of this review. And between the time this movie came out up till now, there's been fan theories in terms of why certain plot points don't add up, such as how is it that people are able to remember Godzilla even though the time travel succeeded in getting rid of Godzilla, and so forth. It got to a point where the producers of the Godzilla franchise, as in Toho Studios, sometime in the later 2010s released a statement saying the official explanation behind the time travel within this movie is a time loop, which is impossible. Because a time loop is when you have a group of characters that come from a really distant future and they go back in time to prevent that future, but the characters in question either end up failing at the task, which allows that future to come into fruition, or they indirectly cause that future to happen in the first place, which leads into a time loop, a series of events that cannot be altered, that must occur one way or the other. A good example of a movie featuring this type of time loop would be Terry Gilliam's 12 Monkeys, starring Bruce Willis. That to me is a good example of how to do a time loop. With this movie, on the other hand, sometime after King Ghidorah's initial rampage, it's revealed that Japan becomes the dominant economic force on planet Earth, doing better than China, Europe, and America, which is why the Futurians traveled back in time in the first place, was to prevent Japan's economic rise in power. Yet sometime after Godzilla defeats King Ghidorah in the past, and you have one of those time travelers traveling back to the 23rd century, it's established that Japan was destroyed. You see the problem with this particular time loop theory? Because remember, time loops cannot be altered. Yet, here's a movie that features a time loop that did get altered. And keep in mind, this is the official statement from Toho themselves. So even their official explanation makes no sense. And here's the thing. I have many other examples, which I will address later, but in short, the introduction of time travel in a Godzilla movie is a cool idea, just poor execution. Another aspect of the movie I had mixed feelings on is the soundtrack itself, because the soundtrack was done by Akira Ifukube, who had not done a soundtrack to a Godzilla movie since Terra Mechagodzilla back in 1975. So it was nice to have someone who worked on the original Showa era of the Godzilla franchise coming back to work on this particular time period of the Godzilla franchise, since Akira Ifukube did not provide the soundtracks for The Return of Godzilla or Godzilla vs. Biollante. As for the music that he composed for this particular movie, it's a mixed bag, because on the one hand, I think it's really cool to hear all these classic bits of the soundtrack that we haven't really heard since the Showa era of the Godzilla franchise, and when we do see Godzilla make his big appearance in the second half of the movie, we also hear his classic theme playing in the background, which not only matches this new incarnation of Godzilla, but also fits the tone of the scene he's presented in. The problem I have with the soundtrack, I will admit, there are some returning classical scores that, while neat to have in there, don't sound as refined as the musical themes used for Godzilla. And some of the newer compositions that were made for this movie are kinda weird. For example, when we first see Godzilla pop out of the ocean in this movie, we don't hear his classic theme right off the bat. We instead hear this magical harp sound play in the background. It's very off-putting. Now, as for the next aspect of the movie I have mixed feelings on is the introduction of Mecha King Ghidorah. Because one of the cooler aspects about this movie is that it showcases King Ghidorah having multiple forms, with his first form being his pre-mutation, where he started out as being these 3 genetically engineered pets called Dorats, which were later merged together thanks to the nuclear testing done in 1944, which turns him into King Ghidorah. But after his battle with Godzilla, he gets brought back using technology from the 23rd century to become the cyborg Mecha King Ghidorah. And to me, Mecha King Ghidorah is an awesome addition to the Godzilla franchise for a few reasons. Reason number one, Mecha King Ghidorah technically is our second cyborg monster, the first being Gigan, but unlike Gigan, we at least got to see what Mecha King Ghidorah was like before becoming a cyborg. So you got that cool addition in regards to its backstory. Second, the moment Mecha King Ghidorah arrives to confront Godzilla is perhaps one of the coolest moments, not just within the movie, but within the entire Godzilla franchise, for a simple reason that the inclusion of Mecha King Ghidorah showing up at the end to confront Godzilla was an unexpected surprise, especially the first time I ever saw the movie as a kid. Because for me, seeing Godzilla fight King Ghidorah was one thing, but seeing Godzilla battling a cybernetic King Ghidorah was just a whole nother level of cool. And seeing the way the mechanical parts of Mecha King Ghidorah function, no matter if it's the wings, the tail tips, or even the middle head, are a really cool thing to see. My big problem with Mecha King Ghidorah is the initial fight between it and Godzilla during the climax of the movie, because the final battle should be really intense, and while I think the final battle is fine, it's nowhere near as engaging as the initial fight between Godzilla and King Ghidorah that occurred earlier in the movie. Because the fight between Godzilla and Mecha King Ghidorah is nothing but them spamming their laser beams or atomic rays at each other for the duration of the fight with very little variety. And I know a lot of people say that Godzilla and Mothra the Battle for Earth kick-started the whole beam war fights in which all the monster battles moving forward would consist of Godzilla and the other monsters spamming their beams at each other. I believe that started with this movie with its climax, but I kinda understand why the fight turned out the way it did, because apparently the Mecha King Ghidorah suit was so heavy that the combination of the suit actor along with the special effects technicians could not physically move the costume in the way they wanted to move it, which is why Mecha King Ghidorah, for a good duration of the fight, is stationary. So I understand why the battle turned out the way it did for the movie. So good idea for a final fight, I just think it could have been handled better. Now, in terms of what I disliked about the movie, some of the composite shots for the movie might have looked great back when this movie first came out, but by today's standards, they don't hold up very well. Also, the scenes that involve of the Japanese Air Force battling King Ghidorah in the sky look awful in my opinion, because I think they use a Ghidorah figure or something, and that Ghidorah figure has no movement to it whatsoever. So anytime you see the jets flying after that model of Ghidorah, it looks super unconvincing. Because there are points in time where you do see King Ghidorah flying, but it's either done with the actual costume itself or a miniature puppet. Yet this figure is really bad because it just doesn't have any articulation to it. It's just something that's moving in this one pose without giving any movement. Now, for the jets, it makes sense because those don't have any organic components to them. So those having unnatural movements make sense. But for something like King Ghidorah, who is organic, moving unnaturally looks very weird and unconvincing. Another problem I have with the movie is the Major Spielberg joke. Because for starters, the rank of Major didn't exist in the US Navy. And the color device, quote-unquote, Major Spielberg wore was that of a lieutenant commander. And on top of that, if you know your history about Steven Spielberg, his father never served in the Navy. He served in the Air Corps. And on top of that, I think the whole Major Spielberg joke in general was really stupid. Another problem I have with the movie has to do with the continuity presented within this movie. And keep in mind, this is even before our main cast of characters even go on their time-traveling mission in order to prevent the birth of Godzilla. Because the Futurians are telling the Japanese in 1992 that in the distant future, Japan gets destroyed by Godzilla. And you have a lot of these board members looking at each other in confusion saying that, why would Godzilla destroy Japan? He's always protected us. And those lines of dialogue make absolutely no sense, considering that this movie takes place within the same continuity as the original 1954 Godzilla movie, along with The Return of Godzilla and Godzilla vs. Biollante. And the way Godzilla has been depicted in those three movies has been that of an antagonistic role. Sure, it's based more on animalistic instinct, but antagonistic nonetheless. So why would the board members claim he's always protected Japan, even though in the past three movies, or more specifically those previous three entries, showcase Godzilla being the villain? Now, for all I could know, maybe this is just the English dub, considering that my frame of reference for this movie is only the English dub, because my physical copy only contains the English dub and not the Japanese version. So that could be a possibility, but still, those lines of dialogue make absolutely no sense within the continuity of this movie. Another continuity error I just thought of actually has to do with the connection between Godzilla vs. Biollante in this movie. Because in Godzilla vs. Biollante, it's established that Godzilla is cold-blooded, because there's a plot point where sometime after the military injects Godzilla with the anti-nuclear bacteria, most of the characters are wondering why isn't the bacteria taking effect? And then that's when they establish that Godzilla is cold-blooded. And in order for the bacteria to work, they have to thrive in a warm environment, which is why the military had to drag Godzilla over to the M6000 Thunder Control System, was so that they can warm him up. With this movie, on the other hand, which takes place 2 years after the events of Godzilla vs. Biollante, within the first 8 minutes, Miki Sagusa is showing a satellite photo of Godzilla's current location, which happens to be infrared. How do we know? Because we literally see where Godzilla is, and when they do a close-up shot of Godzilla's current location within that picture, we see that he's clearly warm-blooded, and not cold-blooded like the previous movie established. Another continuity problem that I noticed revolves around the nuclear submarine that Mr. Shindo owns. Because 2 movies prior to this, the prime minister of that movie stated that the Japanese would never use or own nuclear weapons. Yet, in this movie, one of the main support characters secretly built a nuclear submarine in case of an emergency. This nuclear submarine, in my opinion, is not only just a Deus Ex Machina within the movie, but it also destroys one of the core ideas established in the 1984 Godzilla movie. I think the way they could have handled the nuclear submarine is by having Shindo address one of the main characters being like, hey, I know someone in country X, Y, and Z who has access to a nuclear submarine. Maybe we could use that to revive Godzilla. That, I think, would have made made a lot more sense. Now, going on to the major problems that the movie has in regards to its time travel, because I established a little earlier that the official explanation that Toho gave is that the entire time travel plot of this movie is that of a time loop. I already gave the example as to why our time loop makes no sense, so I'm not going to repeat that here. But moving on to some other problems, one of them being the fact that people still know who and what Godzilla is, which makes no sense, because the overall objective of the Futurians is to get rid of Godzilla from history and replace it with King Ghidorah in order to use King Ghidorah to destroy Japan in the 20th century in order to prevent Japan from becoming the dominant economic force in the 23rd century. And after our main characters take part in that time-traveling trip and succeed in teleporting the dinosaur that would eventually become Godzilla to the year 1982, this should have erased Godzilla from history, and everyone should have forgotten who and what Godzilla is. Yet, when our characters travel back to the year 1982, everyone still has memories of who and what Godzilla is. Which is a problem, because if our main cast of characters succeed in erasing Godzilla from history, then why do people still remember him? Now, I could maybe understand the main cast of characters who took part in the actual time traveling mission itself are the ones that remember who and what Godzilla are because they experienced time travel and maintain those memories because of a phenomenon called the Eye of the Storm effect. Now, before I go any further, if you're wondering what the Eye of the Storm effect is within the realm of time traveling science fiction stories is concerned, from what my general understanding of it is, it's when you have a group of characters who take part in a mission in order to prevent some kind of disaster from occurring. These group of characters go back in time to prevent said disaster and actually succeed in preventing said disaster from ever happening, erasing it from history, but still maintain memories of the previous timeline because they were there at the epicenter of said event. Two examples that come to mind when I think of time traveling stories that utilize the Eye of the Storm effect go to the following examples. Example number one, the Last of the Time Lords episode from the third season of Doctor Who, and the second example being the Flash from the DC Comics anytime DC had to reboot their continuity, no matter if it was the comics or cartoons or even the TV shows, in which the Flash himself resets the entire timeline thanks to the Speed Force and still maintains memories of the previous continuities. Now, if that was the case with the characters who took part in that time traveling mission, I think that would have made a lot of sense, but as the movie sits, our characters succeed in erasing Godzilla from history, and they travel back to the year 1992, but people still have memories of who and what Godzilla is. Now, moving on to some other problems with the time travel plot of this movie, two of them revolve around King Ghidorah himself. The first one being that the moment our main cast of characters succeed in their mission and travel back to the year 1992, King Ghidorah just shows up out of nowhere. And my question is, where has he been? Because the moment the characters succeed in teleporting the dinosaur that would eventually get mutated into Godzilla to the year 1992, that's when the Futurians replaced that dinosaur with the three Dorats, which would eventually get mutated by the radiation merging together to form King Ghidorah. In between that point in time up to the year 1992, where has King Ghidorah been? Has he been on that island sleeping? Or has he just been periodically going on a rampage between that 40-year time gap? That's something that's never explained. Another problem with King Ghidorah occurs when he comes back as Mecha King Ghidorah during the climax, because in the first act in the movie, the Futurians establish a particular rule with time travel in which a person or being cannot exist in the same time twice, which is why Shindo did not join the company on the time travel mission, because he too existed in the year 1944, which meant that if the Shindo from 1992 went back to the year 1944, that would mean one of those Shindos would have to disappear from history, according to the Futurians' rule. Yet, this rule gets broken during the climax of the movie, because this would mean that two King Ghidorahs would exist in the same exact year. One lying at the bottom of the ocean that would remain there for 200 years, surprisingly untouched by sea life, and get resurrected as Mecha King Ghidorah in the 23rd century, only for it to travel back to the year 1982 to fight Godzilla, which would mean that the rule the Futurians established in the first third of the movie is broken. Now, it could be possible that by having Mecha King Ghidorah fighting Godzilla at that exact moment, that would mean the King Ghidorah that's at the bottom of the ocean would disappear, making Mecha King Ghidorah the only King Ghidorah to exist in the year 1992. Another problem with the time travel in this movie is that in the first third of the movie, when we see our characters going on that time traveling mission during World War II, some of the characters from 1992 are afraid they're going to either get injured or die during the battle that's occurring in 1944, but the Futurians explain that no harm will come to them because they are not from that time period. Yet, in the rest of the movie, the evil Futurians, along with Mega King Ghidorah, are destroyed in the year 1992, even though they themselves come from the 23rd century, contradicting what they established in the first third of the movie. Actually, most of the rules that the Futurians established in the first third get contradicted as the movie progresses. And perhaps the biggest problem with the time traveling presented within this movie is that the way the villains use it is super pointless in the grand scheme of things. Because remember, their plan was to get rid of Godzilla, replace him with King Ghidorah so they could use King Ghidorah, along with a supercomputer, to destroy Japan in the 20th century in order to prevent Japan from becoming this economic dominant force in the 23rd century. Yet, halfway through the movie, when we have this congruent battle with Godzilla battling King Ghidorah and our main cast of human characters battling the Futurians, Godzilla managed to defeat King Ghidorah. And when we cut back to the human stuff, our main cast of heroes think they beat the bad guys, but then the bad guys reveal, we don't need King Ghidorah or the supercomputer to destroy Japan, Godzilla will do it for us, showcasing just how pointless their time travel mission was in the grand scheme of things. Also, why did the Futurians need to go to the year 1992 in order to go to the year 1944 in order to kickstart their mission? Because they're from the future, and they have access to the book that details Godzilla, so wouldn't it make just more sense to go from the 23rd century to the year 1944? I don't see any reason as to why they needed to stop in the year 1992 at all in order to kickstart their mission. So, for my final verdict of Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, this is perhaps one of the most unique Godzilla movies, not just within the context of the Heisei series, but within the entire Godzilla franchise as a whole, because of its time travel plot. Sure, the actual time travel element itself isn't handled very well, but it does provide a very entertaining experience, for better or for worse, to a point that I think many people might like the movie for more ironic reasons. That being said, the movie does have a lot of memorable moments, everything from learning about the origin of Godzilla to the introduction of Mega King Ghidorah, even some interactions between Godzilla and a few human characters. And for those reasons alone, I highly recommend Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah. So overall, Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah is perhaps the best Godzilla movie to fall into the category of it's so bad, it's good. And before I give my final rating, what did everyone else have to say about Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah? So it looks like the movie got relatively average reception. And so for my final rating of Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, I give it a 3.5 out of 5. So what is your favorite movie that revolves around time travel that isn't the Back to the Future trilogy? And see you later.